Australia, 1989. A night meant for celebration took a turn so disturbing that it left an entire nation shaken. A party was thrown, but what happened in the shadows of that gathering remains a chilling mystery, one that has haunted the victim's family for decades. The questions surrounding this case are endless, and Leigh's mother has never stopped searching for the truth. As she painfully put it, the way the police handled this whole case sickens me, and I have been fighting for the truth. This is the story of Leigh. Leigh was born on July 24, 1975. From an early age, life wasn't exactly kind to her. When she was around 7, her parents split up, a moment that changed everything. The separation wasn't just an event, it was a deep wound during a crucial time in her childhood. For a few years, she lived with her grandparents, adjusting to a new kind of normal. Eventually, she moved back in with her mother, who had since met someone new. By 1989, Leigh was living in Fern Bay, a small coastal town in New South Wales, with her mother, stepfather Brad, and her little sister. Fern Bay, at the time, wasn't the kind of place where people felt unsafe. It was a quiet suburb by the sea, the kind of town where neighbors knew each other. But beneath that peaceful exterior, something was shifting. Violent crime was creeping up. Just a few years earlier, there had been about 1,800 violent crimes annually in the area. By the late 80s, that number had more than doubled to 3,700. Leigh was 14 in 1989. She was in year 8 at school, surrounded by friends and figuring out her place in the world. She adored animals and had dreams of becoming a veterinarian. Weekends and holidays were often spent at her grandmother's home in Caban Bay, where she felt the most at peace. To those who knew her, Leigh was a kind-hearted, everyday teenage girl. She was just starting to experience more independence, which included being invited to parties, some where alcohol would inevitably be present. On November 3, 1989, Leigh was invited to a birthday party at North Stockton Surf Club. The celebration was for a local boy's 16th birthday, and between 50 and 60 teenagers showed up, most of them from year 10 at Newcastle High School. Though she wasn't close with everyone there, Leigh at least recognized most of the faces. That evening she got dressed and headed to the party with some friends. She arrived at around 7:30 p.m., knowing her mother had arranged to pick her up later that night at 11 p.m. Her mother had given her permission under the assumption that adults would be present, keeping an eye on things. But that wasn't the reality. The party was for the most part completely unsupervised. Among those at the gathering were 2 18-year-old boys, Matthew Webster and Guy Wilson. They weren't just there to celebrate. They had taken it upon themselves to act as makeshift bouncers, their role, marking guests' hands at the entrance, controlling who got in. But these weren't trained security guards, they were teenagers themselves, and their presence would soon become one of the most unsettling aspects of the night. One theory that has circulated over the years is that some of the older boys at the party had a disturbing plan to get younger girls intoxicated and take advantage of them. Witnesses later told police that Matthew Webster had openly bragged about this, even saying that he and others intended to get Leigh and a few other girls drunk so they could go through them. Most of the attendees were well under the legal drinking age, yet alcohol and marijuana flowed freely. The lack of supervision, mixed with reckless drinking, created a recipe for chaos. Inside the venue, a band played, and the atmosphere was wild. The mix of immaturity, alcohol, and teenage energy turned the party into something disorderly, with fights breaking out and inappropriate behavior escalating. At some point, Leigh was given a large amount of whiskey mixed with Coca-Cola. It didn't take long before it was clear that she was heavily intoxicated. Witnesses later recalled seeing her struggling to stay on her feet, her movements sluggish and unsteady. Some even said she couldn't stand without help. She was in no state to defend herself, and then, in that vulnerable moment, something truly horrific happened. The night took a turn no one could have imagined, one that would leave a lasting scar on everyone who knew her. The full truth of what happened that night remains uncertain, but one thing is clear. At some point, Leigh was separated from the party. Whether she was led away willingly or forced against her will is something that has been debated. But either way, she ended up in a secluded part of the sand dunes with someone who had no good intentions. She was taken away from the noise and the lights, away from anyone who could help her. The person responsible for this was just 15 years old. What happened next has been the subject of speculation, but there is no question about the reality of the situation. Leigh was highly intoxicated, barely able to stand, and completely vulnerable. Despite this, there have been attempts to frame what happened as consensual, but at just 14 years old, legally and morally, she could not consent, especially given her condition. What happened to her that night was an assault. When it was over, Leigh stumbled back to the party in a state of distress. She was panicked and visibly shaken. Witnesses later recalled that she was crying, struggling to stay on her feet, and there was blood on her pants. Overwhelmed with fear, she expressed concerns that she might be pregnant. She was moaning in pain, at times collapsing to the ground, unable to cope with what had just happened. In her distress, she called out the name of the boy who had taken her to the dunes, but instead of support or concern, the reaction she received was something far worse. The rumors spread almost instantly. Word got around that she had been with this boy. And instead of recognizing what had really happened to her, some saw it as an opportunity. Guy Wilson, one of the older boys at the party, approached her and crudely suggested that she sleep with him too. When she rejected him, the mood turned hostile. What followed was nothing short of torment. A group of boys, including Matthew Webster, Guy Wilson, and several others who remain unnamed due to legal reasons, surrounded her. There was no escape. They shoved her to the ground and began kicking her. Their attacks were relentless, blows from their feet landing over and over. They spat on her, poured beer over her head, and shouted degrading insults. They called her names meant to strip away her dignity and humiliate her even further. By this point, a crowd had gathered. People stood by, watching it all unfold. Yet not a single person stepped in to stop it. Instead, they laughed as Leigh, in pain and humiliated, struggled to her feet and ran. But even as she fled, the cruelty didn't end. One of the boys threw a glass bottle at her. The last confirmed sighting of Leigh was around 10:30 p.m. as she left the club, heading toward the beach, disappearing into the night. That was when Matthew Webster saw her again. He watched as she walked alone, and he decided to follow. Whether he was the only one trailing behind her remains uncertain, but what is known is that he didn't hesitate when he saw an opportunity. Once deep within the dunes, far from any chance of rescue, he attacked. What happened next was pieced together through forensic evidence and later his own confession. Leigh endured an unimaginable assault, her body subjected to further brutality. It is believed that at some point in her desperation she may have tried to scream for help. To silence her, Matthew grabbed a handful of sand and forced it into her mouth, an act that not only cut off her cries but also further stripped her of any humanity in his eyes. Then came one of the most horrifying details of the attack. A broken beer bottle was used to further violate her. The pain she must have endured in those moments is beyond comprehension. At some point, Matthew and possibly others realized the extent of what they had done. If Leigh survived, she could tell the police everything, and that meant consequences they weren't willing to face. Matthew knew he had to do something. He looked around the dunes, searching for a way to ensure that she would never speak again. That was when he saw it. A large rock, weighing approximately 5.6 kilograms, 12 pounds. As Leigh lay in the sand, already in excruciating pain, he lifted the rock high above his head. And then, without hesitation, he brought it crashing down. The first impact was brutal, but he didn't stop. Again and again he struck her, each blow more forceful than the last. The sheer violence of the attack was so extreme that her skull fractured, leaving brain tissue exposed. Only once she was completely dead did Matthew finally let go of the rock. He fled the scene, leaving behind a horrific crime scene. Blood had splattered across the sand, with some reaching nearly 3 meters from where Leigh's body lay. The brutality of what happened to her in those dunes is something that still haunts those who have studied the case. As 11 p.m. approached, Leigh's mother and stepfather arrived at the venue, expecting to find their daughter waiting. But as they scanned the area, she was nowhere to be seen. Concerned, they walked around, searching through the crowd and checking nearby spots where she might have been. Yet there was no trace of her. At first they tried to reassure themselves. Maybe Leigh had decided to stay at a friend's house without letting them know. It wasn't like her, but it was a possibility. With that in mind, they headed back home, hoping she would show up soon. But as the hours passed and the night turned to morning, their worry deepened. Leigh never came home. Something was wrong. At first light, her stepfather set out to search again. He retraced his steps from the night before, this time expanding his search beyond the club. As he moved through the sand dunes, less than 100 meters from where the party had been, he saw something that made his heart drop. There, lying in the sand, was Leigh. The sight before him was something no parent should ever have to see. He immediately called emergency services, his voice filled with panic and devastation. The police arrived quickly, securing the area as a crime scene. Leigh's body was carefully removed and taken in for an autopsy. When the results came back, the findings were beyond horrifying. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. The force had been so extreme that her skull was shattered, exposing brain tissue. But there was more. As investigators studied the injuries, they found something disturbing, evidence suggesting that the fatal blows had come from multiple directions. This wasn't the act of just one person. Leigh's injuries painted a picture of the brutal attack she endured. Her ribs, liver, and kidneys had suffered massive trauma, showing that she had been beaten severely. The damage suggested repeated, forceful blows. There were also signs of strangulation, with hemorrhages in her eyes and neck that indicated someone had choked or compressed her airway. The injuries to her body didn't end there. What they found next was even more appalling. The forensic team uncovered severe internal injuries, including deep tearing and bleeding. The wounds were consistent with the use of a broken beer bottle, a detail that revealed the depths of cruelty she had suffered. Sand had also been found in her mouth and airway, suggesting it had been forcibly shoved inside. Her body was partially undressed, and blood was scattered across a large area, confirming that the attack had been prolonged and incredibly violent. All of this led investigators to one horrifying conclusion. More than one person had taken part in what happened to Leigh that night. News of Leigh's murder quickly spread, and the details of her case gripped the public. Her young age, the sheer level of violence involved, and the fact that this had happened in a setting filled with other teenagers made it impossible to ignore. The police launched an intensive investigation, determined to find those responsible. It wasn't an easy process. Officers worked tirelessly to reconstruct the events leading up to her death, but they quickly ran into obstacles. The crime scene was thoroughly examined, and forensic teams combed through every piece of evidence they could find. But gathering information from witnesses proved far more difficult. Approximately 150 people were questioned, but many of them were uncooperative. Misinformation, rumors, and conflicting accounts slowed progress. One of the biggest hurdles investigators faced was the silence from the local community. Many of the partygoers were teenagers, and they either didn't want to get involved or feared getting in trouble themselves. But what was even more troubling was the attitude of some of the parents. Instead of encouraging their children to speak up, many parents actively discouraged them from talking to the police. Some didn't want their kids implicated in underage drinking or drug use, while others may have known that their children had played a role in the harassment Leigh suffered before she disappeared. There were even reports that some parents pressured other families to remain silent. The combination of fear, guilt, and self-preservation meant that crucial details were withheld, and key witnesses never came forward. Some who did speak later admitted to lying in their statements. Because of this, investigators were left with an incomplete picture of what had truly happened. Despite the challenges, detectives pressed on, focusing their efforts on the boys who had been at the party. They took blood samples from several potential suspects and collected the clothing they had worn that night. One of those suspects was Matthew Webster. Investigators went through photographs taken at the party, searching for any inconsistencies. That's when they found something that stood out. An image of Matthew wearing one outfit at the party, but a completely different set of clothes had been turned over to police. This immediately raised suspicions. Why would he change his clothes? What was he trying to hide? Witnesses had already stated that Matthew had followed Leigh into the dunes, so investigators zeroed in on him. When questioned, Matthew struggled to provide a clear account of his whereabouts at the time of the murder. 3 months after Leigh's death, the pressure on Matthew reached its breaking point. At first, he denied any involvement. But as investigators presented more evidence, his demeanor shifted. The weight of the accusations, the inconsistencies in his story, and the relentless questioning finally got to him. He broke down and confessed. What he revealed was chilling. Matthew claimed that he had seen Leigh walking alone towards the end of the parking lot near the dunes. He called out to her, supposedly warning, "Leigh, don't go down there." According to him, she turned around and snapped, telling him to leave her alone. But instead of doing so, he followed her. He claimed that he found her sitting on the grass and approached her, striking up a conversation. But his intentions weren't innocent. He admitted to the police that he had gone there planning to force himself on her. However, in his version of events, he tried to make it seem like she had willingly gone with him into the bushes. He insisted that the two were about to engage in consensual sex when she suddenly pushed him away and said, "Don't! I don't want to." He claimed that this rejection made him snap. He said that in a fit of rage, he grabbed her throat, choked her, and then picked up a rock and brought it crashing down onto her head, over and over, until she was lifeless. After this confession, Matthew Webster was arrested and charged with Leigh's murder. But there was one glaring issue. While he admitted to killing her, he never mentioned the brutal assault with the broken bottle, and the police never asked him whether he acted alone. If he wasn't the one responsible for that part of the attack, then who was? And if others were involved, how many? These unanswered questions still lingered, casting a dark shadow over the case. During the investigation, the 15-year-old boy mentioned earlier was also taken into custody. Because he was a minor at the time, many details about the legal proceedings were not made public. Initially, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 6 months in a juvenile detention center. However, this decision was later challenged. Upon appeal, the court determined that there was not enough concrete evidence to prove the full extent of the assault, and as a result, his sentence was significantly reduced. Instead of time in detention, he was ordered to complete 100 hours of community service. This outcome left many feeling that justice had not been properly served. Meanwhile, the focus of the investigation shifted to another suspect, 18-year-old Guy Wilson. He admitted to mistreating Leigh at the party, pushing her, dumping beer over her head, spitting on her, and even attempting to throw a bottle at her. Despite these admissions, he was released on bail while awaiting sentencing. During this time, he allegedly made a disturbing comment about Leigh's younger sister. When Leigh's stepfather, Brad, found out, his grief and anger overwhelmed him. He confronted Guy in a heated altercation that turned physical. While the exact details of the confrontation were not widely reported, it was serious enough to result in legal consequences for Brad. In court, he pleaded guilty to the charge, but given the emotional weight of the situation, the judge chose not to record a conviction. Instead, Brad was placed on a 12-month good behavior bond. As for Guy, he also pleaded guilty to his actions against Leigh, but received only 100 hours of community service as his punishment. Matthew Webster, the primary suspect, pleaded guilty to Leigh's murder before his trial could officially begin. His confession meant that there was no need for a lengthy court case detailing every aspect of what had happened. However, there was one glaring issue. While he admitted to killing Leigh, he firmly denied having any part in the brutal assault with the broken bottle, which had caused severe internal injuries. If he wasn't responsible for that, then who was? The question hung over the case like a dark cloud, and it was never fully answered. Some witnesses stepped forward with statements that suggested Matthew wasn't the only one involved. Multiple people claimed they saw both Matthew and Guy Wilson leave the surf club together that night. Additionally, the 15-year-old boy, who had been among the first to harass Leigh, never provided a solid alibi for where he was around the time of her death. Yet, despite these details, the investigation never went any further. Forensic evidence at the scene pointed to the possibility of multiple attackers, yet only Matthew faced charges for the murder. The assault, which had left devastating injuries, was never addressed in court. This meant that others who may have played a role in what happened that night walked away without any consequences. To this day, many believe that justice was never fully served. The way the case was handled raised serious concerns about law enforcement's approach. Investigators were criticized for how they gathered and processed evidence, and even more troubling, several of the suspects, including Matthew, claimed they had been physically assaulted by officers during questioning. But perhaps the most frustrating failure of all was how long it took police to formally charge Matthew with murder. Even though they knew early on that he had lied about his whereabouts, it still took 3 months for them to take action. Leigh's family was left heartbroken, not only by the loss of their daughter, but also by the justice system's failure to hold everyone accountable. It was clear that more than one person had attacked Leigh that night, yet only one man served time. In June 2014, after spending 14.5 years behind bars, Matthew Webster was released on parole. His release was another painful blow for Leigh's family, who had already endured so much. They have since become vocal advocates, pushing for stronger and more thorough investigations in cases involving sexual violence and murder. They hope that by speaking out, they can help prevent other families from experiencing the same heartbreak and frustration they have endured. As of today, no one else has been convicted for the brutal crimes committed against Leigh. Leigh's case remains one of Australia's most haunting mysteries, and the questions surrounding that night have never truly been answered. But what do you think? Do you believe justice was served, or do you think there's more to this story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Please consider subscribing to the channel, giving this video a like, and sharing it with others who might find it compelling. Your support helps us continue to bring you these important stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.